Today is Thursday, February 10th, 2022, and I'm Carrie Lincourt, and this person here on the video is Rich Lincourt, and we're going to ask him some questions about his life.
Uh-oh.
So where were you born, and where did you go to school?
You know, with all mobility, I guess I kind of take a little bit of, I think it's pride. Maybe it's not pride, but I guess it's a point of being unusual. I was born in Mission Hospital, Huntington Park, California in 1941. And when I started school, I went to State Street Elementary School. Went to 6th grade there. Graduated, went to...
You didn't go to preschool?
No preschool. No preschool. And then went to Gage Junior High School, 7th and 8th. It wasn't a middle school in those days. It was a junior high school. And some junior high schools were 3 years. This one was 2, 7th and 8th grade. I loved sports there. I was student body vice president. Pat Gilmore was president of the student body. We later became...
That's in junior high?
We later in high school became boyfriend and girlfriend. Probably I was her first love and she was my first love. It did not last, but that's the fact of the matter, Pat Gilmore. Her mom worked at Weinman's, and I would know her by shopping at Weinman's. My mother operated a horseshoe counter luncheonette, I guess you'd say, right behind Hilo Market. My father was the cashier, her sister was the waitress, and my mom was the cook. And she did a good job of that because that place was packed every lunch hour. She made the greatest hamburgers. As I grew up, I went to swimming lessons.
Wait, slow down. So how old were you when she opened the lunch counter? Do you have any?
Well, I'm going to guess about that. I was probably in junior high school because her promotion for her opening was pie and coffee, and it was either for 15 cents or a quarter. Can't quite remember that, but it was either 15. And I passed out these cards, so I don't think they would have let me walk the streets and pass out cards. Although in those days it was probably that was more possible than it would be today. But I don't think they'd have done that if I was in grade school. In any case, finished swimming. When you swim, you get hungry. I'd walk there at lunchtime, have a hamburger. Sometimes I'd do it with my friend, although I can't remember that very well. And my mom made 4 or 5 homemade pies every day that she completely sold out.
Wow.
Every day she would, from scratch, make homemade pies. And it was a lunch kind of thing. I don't know whether there was a success or not, but they did it for a while.
How many years?
I'm going to say 2 or 3, probably. I don't know. It's a lot of hard work. And then she went on to be the cook at a preschool, at a kindergarten preschool, Rita Blair Kindergarten. It was sort of a place where working people took their kids because I think they may have had extended day or something like that, or whatever version of that would have been in those days. But my mom made lunch for 100 kids every day. And she would set out the plates, and she would make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and put them in quarters, and maybe put 2 of those on every plate, and maybe a little of this on the plate and a little something else on the plate. Interesting story about that, a cool story about that is, one day she told me she was working and cleaning up and everything, and she saw this speck. She saw this speck on a chair, I'm going to say. I think it was on a chair, I don't know. Anyway, she picked it up with her finger, and I think maybe she put it in her pocket. I may not have this all right, but it's still a good story. And when she later looked at it, it was the diamond in her engagement ring. Yeah, which was a speck, which was an absolute little speck.
I think it's the one I have. I have her.
Yeah, it could be. And one of the reasons I love Annie Pinto, Raphael's wife, is that Annie's ring from Raphael looks exactly like my mother's. Anyway,
why is that moving to you? Oh, well,
it was just ring. It just brought my mom to my mind.
Yeah.
And my mom was so special because she was growing up. We started out on Walnut Street, and my dad rented. My dad was the first educated kid in his family. I guess he was the only child, but he was still the first one to go to college and became a certified public accountant, CPA. And he worked, and they started out renting on Walnut Street, and that was during World War II. Now, my brother and his buddies would come to Walnut Street during the war when they had leave in Southern California. My brother served in the Pacific through the war. He was pretty darn young. He was when the war started, he was 17 years old. So he was just a puppy when he was in the Navy. And he served on what they called a garbage scow. So I think a garbage scow, I'm not sure what that is, but I think a garbage scow was a ship that serviced the warships. Maybe picked up their garbage, offloaded provisions, etc. But at the end of the war, he was part of the Japanese occupation. I've heard him speak of being in Japan after the war with all the devastation and going to bathrooms that were kind of common bathrooms. There were men and women together sitting, and it was, I guess, their cultural way. I don't know, but that kind of stuck in my mind. And he was also there for the Bikini bomb tests, because I'm not sure what the date of that was. I'm sure it was in the 40s, because in 45, that Hiroshima and Nagasaki are, I think we only had 2 bombs, but one was dropped on one city and one was dropped on the other city. And they continued then to develop that weapon. And part of that development was what was called dropping the bomb in the water on an atoll in the Pacific. And the atoll, I think, was named Bikini, like the bikini bathing suit. I'm not sure whether that was the same. But he was there for those tests.
He saw them.
He would have R&R in Honolulu, Hawaii. And he learned to surf. But in those days, they didn't have.
Why does that make you emotional?
My brother.
Yeah.
And I'm 80. They didn't have the kind of boards they had today, which would be fiberglass that were light and, blah, blah, blah. They had what they called the longboards, and they were made out of redwood. And they were heavy, and they were long, and they were completely different than the way that they surf today. But my brother surfed and surfed and surfed and surfed. He surfed so often and so much that they stopped. They just said, "I'll just take the board." And
he would borrow.
But he spent a lot of time surfing, and he was always I think he was a pretty damn good athlete. He was a hunter. He lived in Julian growing up, and went to high school there. Lived with his dad. His dad had a gold mining claim out on the edge of the desert at the foot of the mountains, and he would go home from school. He'd go home from school in the afternoon as a young kid, and he'd get the gun out, and he'd go out and he'd get quail, or he'd get pigeons, rabbits, whatever he could get. And in what I'm sure was a very meager place where they lived, there was a wood stove that was kept hot all the time, and on the back of that stove was a pot. And in that pot was whatever he got that day. And they'd eat they'd add beans to it, and there's sauce there. It was kind of like sourdough starter. It was something that they used, and then you'd keep using it and using it and using it and using it. Well, that pot was sort of the household pot, and he would he'd skin out the quail, or he would get dove or whatever, skin out the rabbit, and that would go in the pot with add more beans to it, and it would just sort of simmer continuously, and that's how they ate. Now, I think that's the truth. That's my recollection of what he has told me, and I think it's, you know, it's a different sort of life. But he grew up as a hunter. When I was a young boy, he would take me hunting. Well, yeah, he'd take me hunting up on Volcan Mountain. And in those days, it was an Indian reservation. And there were the Indians lived on dirt floors in log houses. And this would have been in the 1950s. And he would take me up there, and we would go into those houses. And I think he knew some of the people. He knew them well enough that we got into their houses. But what we would do then is to go out, and they used to log up on Volcan Mountain in San Diego County, and we'd be up there with our 22s. Now, I didn't have a 22. I never owned a gun in my life. Don't want one. Don't like them. But we would sit up there, and squirrels would run out of the piles of slash from the logging, and et cetera, et cetera. I'm telling you, I said this at Norm's funeral, but as a young boy, he became my hero, because he could hit a squirrel in the head, running across an uneven, and he could do it twice in a row with 2 shots. I mean, he became my hero. Jeez, look what he's doing.
Yeah.
And
Did
I
he
have
see
a vivid
action
memory of that.
in World War II? Did he ever?
I don't think, you know, in terms of action, I'm not certain. But he was in the Pacific. That's where he served, and I think he served warships. So I would assume that he was in harm's way. I don't think he was ever if he came under fire, if his ship ever came under fire, he never told me about it. And but he was a Navy guy.
Keep going.
When he came back from the service, he moved to Julian. He had gone to Julian High School. He lived with his dad, and he then came in contact with Mylene Porter. And Mylene Porter was the daughter of Milo and Leela Porter, who had, this is another super story. They had come to Julian. They had come to Julian from Borrego, California, when Mylene was a little girl, not when my brother met her when she was probably just finishing high school and he was coming back from the Navy. I think he was about 4 years older than her. But Mylene parents, the two of them, along with the brothers Mervyn and Jim, had homesteaded a parcel of land in Borrego Valley. And it was in the desert. Borrego is the desert, absolutely the desert. They lived in a house with a tin roof in the desert. Mylene speaks of enormous, awful heat. Forget about air conditioning. The best they had was shade. But she went to school as a young girl, which would have been in the 30s, late 30s, or yeah, I would say the early 30s, in Borrego. She went to school barefoot. And Milo became the mailman and the constable in Borrego. He was the constable in Borrego, and he would bring the mail to Julian or take the mail from Julian to there, probably both things. And that's how, and along with that, which was pretty cool, they looked around and they said, well, how else can we make money? And they would make sandwiches. They would make a bunch of sandwiches. and they would take them and sell them to the farm workers down in Imperial Valley, or maybe not Imperial Valley. I don't know. Down in the valley, wherever there was people that they could sell them to. So between constable and mailman and sandwiches, that's how they existed. That's how they existed. They then came to Julian, and I don't know how, but they were able to buy the old schoolhouse, which is sort of a Victorian building. They were able they were able to buy the gas station that they later expanded to bulk gasoline with 4 or 5,000 gallon tanks, where they had a bulk gasoline business. And then there was another tank standing separate from that of stove oil. Now, I don't know what stove oil is, whether that's coal oil or what, but they had an old converted army truck with a tank on the back of it, and that's how people heated their houses before propane. It was with stove oil. And then in addition to that, they had, I guess, a couple of businesses in downtown Julian. Now, Julian was nothing but a single one-lane street. No traffic lights. There were 4 gas stations in Julian. There was the Chevron station, the Texaco station, the Shell station, and Norm's Mobile station. There were 4 stations in the town of Julian, which I suspect was way too many. But and when I was 16 years old, I used to work for Norm. I'd go up there and spend the whole summer. I would grease cars, I would pump gas, I would do all those kinds of things. And Norm, when he came back from the war, ran the gas station. He ran the gas station. He fell in love with Mylene, and Mylene fell in love with him. And they were married. And the first place they lived was in that schoolhouse, because that schoolhouse was then converted into, at least I can count 1, 2, 3 apartments, and there may have been 4. But in the middle of that place was sort of the auditorium for the school. And that auditorium had velvet drapes, still had velvet drapes. And when I was there and saw it, and had other kinds of fixtures that were, very, very period with respect to when that building was built. I believe it's still in the Porter Trust. Jim is the guy that manages that trust, and there's still apartments down there. At one point, Norm expanded his gasoline, mechanical, bulk gasoline business into a parts house, and the parts house was in one part of that place. Milo and Leela, I'll never forget this. Milo and Leela somehow, at some point, had enough money that they went to a place called Bombay Beach on the Salton Sea, and they had a house down there, and it was pretty rudimentary, and et cetera, but we would go down there, and there was a small boat with a 35 horsepower engine on it, and we could go water skiing with that boat. And I could do it on 2 skis. I wasn't very good, but my damn brother, all of a sudden he'd pop out of the boat and he'd get on 1 ski and he'd get up and he'd go swishing back and forth. He's my hero. Later became my best man when I married your mom. There's a picture.
Yeah.
And I figured out, I was married at around 23. I was married when I was 23. So that picture, he's 17 years older than I am. So he was 40 years old in that picture. And I think we both had crew cuts, or at least I had a crew cut. And I was, and that was when I married your mom, and we were together for, I think it was 18 years. Anyway, what else? Norm and Mylene finally left that apartment in Julian, and they had property that they had, I guess they had bought, maybe off of Milo, but maybe they just used Milo's property because Milo had acreage around all the gas station. They later had a transit mix business, and then the schoolhouse, apartments, and there was land and land and land, and Milo and Leela built a house, and right next to there, Norm and Mylene built a house, and they used my parents' plans. My parents had built a architectural, a one-of-a-kind 2-bedroom house in Huntington Park, California. And when Norm and Mylene got ready to build their house, they took my parents' plans, and the houses weren't exactly the same.
House in Julian?
In Julian was used. They used the same plans as the house we lived in Huntington Park.
So, do you know if the house in Huntington Park is still there?
The house is there. The original farmhouse, my parents' first piece of property that they ever owned after renting. Oh, I kind of need to go back to Walnut Street because Walnut Street's pretty cool. It's really pretty cool. My brother would go to when he was on leave, he'd come to the house and he'd stay at the house and he'd bring his buddies. The name that comes to my mind is Tubby. And one of my huge regrets is that there was a kind of like an autograph book, sort of a book where people.
I feel like I've seen it.
I just give anything to put my hands on it. And in any case, they would come and they would stay. My mother would cook for them. My dad drank. My brother, I've never thought of him as a drinker. My dad had a drinking problem, I think. But during the war, when Norm was in town, they would go down on a place in Southgate, California on Tweedy Boulevard, and they'd go to the bars down there. And they would pick up sailors. And bring them home to the house and feed them home cooking. And they became special. As a matter of fact, one such couple, a few years later, fell on hard times and came to the house I'll tell you about in a second. And they lived with us for months and months and months. My mom gave her clothes, and I don't know why they were on hard times, but my mom helped them out. But I was, as you can imagine, I was not much more than a toddler, or maybe I just was a toddler. In fact, I think I can remember the end of World War II. I remember my mother carrying me in her arms outside the back door with bright, bright sunlight. So it had to be in the afternoon. I had just been picked up from a nap, and she went out and told me that the war was over. World War II was over. And so that was probably, I don't know why, I think that was in August, but I think it was during the summertime. And I don't quite remember this, but I remember walking down Walnut Street, and you could walk through this backyard, and you could go through a place where they sold, a nursery where they sold plants, and you could walk up to Florence Avenue. And the cars were coming, and the horns were honking, and a guy was coming down the street blowing a bugle, and there was a huge celebration. The other thing I remember about that time was in those days you had what was called ration stamps. You had ration stamps, and they weren't like green stamps or blue stamps or whatever the hell they called those incentive stamps.
Yeah.
They allowed you to buy so much of certain things that were priority items, and they did not want to run on those things because they needed those things for the war effort. So they controlled that by giving you ration. You had ration coupons according to the size of your family, I suppose. And you would go to the store, and you would have to, if you were going to buy that item, you had to, it was probably grease or I don't know what the items were. But you would. I remember going to Ralph's, and you'd get your ration stamps out, and that's what you had to do to get whatever you were going to get. And but then after Walnut Street, the war had ended, and I would say in about 47 or 48, my parents bought the old farmhouse on Olive Street, 4 houses from the corner. And next to that was a lot that they then built their house on. So we had the farmhouse and then the vacant lot. First thing my dad did was to add 2 bedrooms on the back of the farmhouse. And I think it was kind of awful.
Them?
I don't know he could build things. The bookcase in the other room in there that you ought to have someday is something he built. He had an interest in that. He was pretty good at it, I think. I mean, I don't know how good, but pretty good. Kind of like I am today. And he built 2 bedrooms. But the pitch of the farmhouse was this, and the pitch of the of the 2 bedrooms were like this, and the farmhouse was so low to the ground. I don't know what kind of foundation it had. It must not have been much, because I can remember when they first bought the place, we pulled up the boards in the living room, and there was a window right next to that, and I can remember pitching, and this was all very sandy loam. It wasn't hard clay. It had been a riverbed, I guess, at some point. I mean, Lord only knows. Certainly wasn't then. And they shoveled sand out from under the boards so that the boards would do a better job of lasting, I think, because the sand was lowered down from the boards. And what was really cool about that, 2 things that stick in my mind, well, maybe 3 or 4 things that stick in my mind. One thing was we had gone up to Crestline, and we had kind of on a little bit of a vacation, and I vividly remember my dad was kind of upset with me because I think I was afraid of the water at Crestline Lake. Was it Crestline Lake? It was in Crestline, but Lake Gregory. I think his name is Lake Gregory. I don't know. But he came up and he pushed me down.
Into the water?
Into the edge of the water. And because he was angry with me for some other reason. I mean, I'm gonna make excuses for him, right? It doesn't make any difference, but that stuck with me.
Yeah.
And I cried, and I didn't like that. But when we got ready to leave Crestline and the rented cabin that we had, somehow we walked on this squirrel that had fallen out of a tree. He was an injured squirrel. We put him in a shoebox. We brought him home to Olive Street. We put him in a bird cage. I think it was a bird cage, and I may be getting mixing that up with the parakeet that we had, but maybe we had 2 bird cages. I don't know. In any case, he lived for a long, long time, and when he died, I would say prayers every night. I would say the Lord's Prayer. I would say, "Now I lay me down to sleep." And I got that from my grandmother, because my grandmother, Carrie, who you're named after, as far as I'm concerned, would sit. She was Catholic, and my dad had been Catholic, but she would sit in a rocking chair, and she would every afternoon. She was a lot like Christina, very, very devoted, very, very. It was important to her. If she didn't do this, she was being bad, I think, or she wasn't being loyal to Eugene, her husband, who had died. And she would say those prayers every afternoon. As I was growing up, when I was probably in late elementary school, 5th, 6th grade, and then 7th, 8th grade.
You're sure she was Catholic?
Yeah, I'm almost sure. I can't say that for certain, but I think my dad was, and I'll explain that maybe later. But she would say these prayers, and on the anniversary.
Do you remember a rosary?
I didn't see a rosary. It was a sheaf of papers that had her prayers in it, and she held on to them, and she would. I don't recall her being so much out loud. I think she spoke very softly, but that was something, whether I was there or not, that happened every afternoon. And I spent the night with her, and we would play board games. We would play Parcheesi. We would play rummy. We would play checkers. she would make potato salad or Lincourt spaghetti, or those are the two things that I remember for dinner.
Is she the author of Lincourt Spaghetti?
She is.
Okay.
She is the source of Lincourt spaghetti. I don't know who it was handed down from, but she grew up in Springfield, Massachusetts, a place where Bob lives very close to now. And she married Eugene, and Eugene was a ragman and a barber. Very simple people. I don't think in those days women worked that much, but that's how he supported the family, as being a barber. And I think he was a ragman. And my grandmother's father, who was Middleton, Grandpa Middleton, who I never knew, but he worked on the railroad. He was a switchman or a maintenance guy. I don't know. He had a job on the railroad. I recall that. I recall that. Dad never said this to me, but I, over the years, found out, I think, that he was married to a person named Gladys, and I can't remember her name. And I think that my dad and that woman had a child. And I may have a brother out there someplace, but my dad never spoke of it. But I don't know whether my mom talked to me about it or what. But in 1952, when we went back there, and the only time we went back there, we visited her, etc. She had a candy store in Springfield, and somehow that kind of came to the surface. I don't know exactly how, but I think my dad was resentful of the fact that in those days, if you were a Catholic and you were married, you really couldn't get divorced.
Mm-hmm.
That was something that Catholics, didn't happen to Catholics.
Mm-hmm.
And whether Gladys raised the child or didn't raise the child or gave the child away, I mean, I just don't know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In any case, that's my recollection, vague recollection of all that. And as I've said to you before, my mom had a tough time growing up in this sense. She was part of a farm family. They had a section of land. I don't know how large it was, but they were a farm family. And her father supplemented their income. He became the sheriff of Burnett County. And I swear that I've got this story. I think it's true, may not be true, but he had a horse and wagon that he drove around, and he was the sheriff. And I seem to think that Tobias Thorson, her father, came home with arrows stuck in the wagon. Now, that's probably not true, but that's what's in my head.
Sure.
And in any case, they were farmer and that sort. And there was about a dozen kids. And in those days, mortality was an issue, a huge issue. They didn't have the medicine and techniques that we have today. But I would say in the early part of 1900, my mom was born in 1903. My dad was born in 1898. This farm family, I think they buried two children in the same casket. Diphtheria comes to mind. I don't know. But the long and the short of it, what I'm stumbling to get to, is that when my mom was probably 17, she might have been younger. I don't think she was older. The doctor that came to her farm and doctored the family, and somehow took my mother to town. And in the process of taking my mother to town, she was a teenager, remember. He was a doctor. He had two children. He had a wife. He got my mom pregnant. And my mom, being pregnant, which must have been a disgrace, because she had a guy, Wes. I don't think she named him. I don't know whether she named him or not. But she had the child, and in those days, you spent maybe a week or 2 weeks in the hospital when you had a child. And after that happened, the child...
She went to the hospital. She didn't just have him at home?
I'm telling you my
Okay.
recollection.
She was in the, yeah.
I could be wrong about that, but the essence of the story is that she gave up. That child was taken from her at 2 weeks. She then left Burnett County with an 8th grade education, a teenager, as an au pair. I think that's a helper for a family.
Yeah.
With a family, and they came to La Jolla, California. And she's got an 8th grade education. She's a teenager. And in the process of that, she meets Henry Cousins, who worked as an aircraft worker during World War II and after World War II. He was a very simple, plain man who she was married to and had Helen and Norm, 2 children, with him. But that marriage didn't last. Now, whose idea that was, how that happened, I have...
She told me that he was the only person she ever told about Wes.
Oh, okay.
And that he told her that they would get Wes back.
I think I've heard that before. Henry was a pretty good guy. He was Norm's dad, and I came to know Henry up in Julian, California. But then she met my dad, and I believed by that time she was mature enough, and I would think she would say that my dad was the love of her life. Mm-hmm. But he was a handful. He was a handful because he drank too much, and he was the drunk guy, and she was the sober guy. And I can recall them fighting and having issues over that. I know that out of frustration and I never saw my dad with a drink in his hand ever. In those days, drinking there was a social stigma to it. I mean, abortion I don't know when it ended, when it started, but it was during their lifetime. So there was a stigma that going with drinking. And my dad would keep his bottle of 4 Roses under the sink in the bathroom. Now, that's not like
What's
I couldn't...
4 Roses? Is that bourbon?
It was a brand of liquor.
Yeah.
And the reason I know that is because I could go in there and I could open it up and there was a bottle of liquor under the sink. Now, again, I never saw him with a drink in his hand. But if he had a drink, I knew immediately that he had a drink. Yeah. Whether I had been in the house when he had it or not, it was his nose or it was his tone of voice or I don't know. To this day, I'm extremely sensitive about people who drink, and because I can see the changes that happen in people when they drink.
Sure.
And that was a big problem for me. In fact, I never drank until I was at the end of high school. I was drink was something that I didn't do, and I guess that was the upside of my dad's drinking. I don't know, but I did drink at the end of my college life. Now, in today's sensibility, you got to be careful about kids drinking before they're teenagers, and worse, and there's almost a badge of honor that goes with how much can you consume. Drinking is it's a scourge in many ways, I think, these days.
Especially when their minds are still developing. I mean, that's what I think about.
In any case, my mom and dad suffered through that. At one point, my dad wanted to take us on a 3-week railroad trip from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C., to New York, to Massachusetts, and down the Atlantic coast, across the Gulf, across Texas. And it was going to be a 3-week Pullman train ride with stops along the way. And my mom insisted that she wasn't going to do that if we didn't stop drinking.
They made me wait a lot at the